Dr. Janelle Olitz, and I am the Cooperative Extension Agent in Durham County, but I happen to have a PhD in soil science, and soil health is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. And I'm from New Hampshire, where we have a lot of people that have adopted high tunnel usage. And I know that that can be a totally different ballgame when it comes to managing soil health. So I put this presentation together hoping that I can assist people that may either have a high tunnel or are thinking of it, what to really be aware of. So today I'm going to first really get a baseline of presenting what my definition of soil health is, as well as going over what I believe is the definition of sustainable and regenerative agriculture. Because I think when you're thinking of these, there's a lot of terms that are thrown around, and it's important to understand my point of view, or at least what I believe those are. Some basics of soil properties that are very important to understand when trying to manage for soil health. Then conditions that are unique to high tunnels when it comes to trying to manage that soil health, and then some techniques on how to address that and begin to develop that soil health within a high tunnel. But first, the definition of soil health. This one comes from the USDA NRCS, and it is really the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. So I really kind of like this because it encompasses the full system instead of just looking at soil as a substrate in which we plant plants into. But then we move on to something a little bit more in depth, and that's sustainable agriculture. And often people kind of get confused when they're talking about sustainable agriculture. A lot of people, if you were to poll them, they'd say it's really focused on the environment. And as you can see from this diagram here, that 1/3 of that is the environmental aspect of it. And then we also want to bring in the societal aspect of that, as well as the economic part of it. And it's when we address all three of these things that we actually, in fact, get to the center. That is where we're talking about sustainable agriculture. When you practice sustainable agriculture, you have to take into account the societal, the economic, and the environmental impacts of your practices to really bring about sustainability. And so some of these approaches, really when you're looking at it, you're thinking about the productivity of your operation and the soil and ability to have a high yield, because that's important. Your stewardship of the land for that soil health, and as well as water and air health. Profitability, because you need to make a livable wage as a farmer. And your quality of life. If you become profitable, but you're working 20 hours a day, that may not necessarily be sustainable over the long term. And some of the practices in sustainable agriculture are also practices that are linked to soil health. There's integrated pest management, which really is understanding what that pest is that's there, and the minimal treatment that needs to be to manage it. You may have a pest, but the threshold of that pest isn't enough to be worth spraying for it. It may not be even something that would harm your yield. Crop rotation is important. It helps to reduce pathogen load, and also benefits the soil health. Managing your water really well, ensuring there's drainage, and also ensuring that you have ways to store that water within the ground, allowing more of the water to go in the ground and that rather than run off. Reducing the soil disturbance, adding the cover crops, those are all really kind of focused right in on that microbial community. And by focusing on the microbial community, you can really benefit your nutrient management and also conserving energy on the farm as well. Then we move on to regenerative agriculture, which is slightly different than sustainable agriculture. If you think about sustainable agriculture, it's really, you are sustaining a system at this current time, and you're going to sustain it for a long period of time. But if your system is already kind of fouled up and not working very well, why would you want to sustain it? It's kind of like human health. If you wake up and you function and you go to work, but you're not feeling great today, you may not necessarily be able to sustain that for a long time. What you want is to focus on being healthy. And so that's really where regenerative agriculture gets at. And I like this definition, although there is not a specific definition that has been agreed upon by the powers that be. But this is a very nice, succinct one, and that's a system of farming principles and practices that increases biodiversity, enriches the soils, improves watersheds, and enhances ecosystem services. And so this is kind of where when a lot of people that focus on soil health think about regenerative agriculture, this is kind of where they're thinking about, at least where my mind space is. So now we're going to move on to some soil basics. And one of the things I want you to really understand and take away is that soil is dynamic. It is changing all the time. If you measure it today and you take it to a soil lab and you get your results, rains overnight, now you're going to measure it tomorrow, you will get a very different result. Anything that happens within that soil, whether that's changing the biology, so it's biotic pressures, or even abiotic, whether that's temperature or rainfall or some other climatic influence, that changes what actually happens below the ground. It is not always going to stay the same. And so getting a baseline from a soil test is important, but also in the back of your mind, knowing that there are factors that constantly change that environment from hour to hour because it is a living system. And a soil is made up of layers. And so this is known as the pedon. It's basically a unit of soil. And at the top, we have our organic matter that's there, and then we have the organic layer. We have an A horizon. And so in general, the roots often stay in these spaces. It's where we want our water to be stored and our nutrients to be stored. And then down in the base is the subsoil and that parent material that makes up the soil. And soil is really kind of formed from the bottom and it moves upwards to the top. Now digging a little deeper, when we think about soil as a very small component, if I were to take a shovel full of soil and let it dry a little bit, I get a little bit of a little ball of soil in my hand. This is what this kind of represents when I think of soil as a makeup of the mineral, which is made up of particles, and then also half of it, or part of that 50% of the actual physical thing is organic matter. Although that is a baseline 5%. In North Carolina, in the Southeast, it's likely a lot less than that because it's hard to build organic matter in warmer environments because the microbes have an opportunity to continue to eat them and decompose them for a lot longer period of time than say in Minnesota, where it's frozen half of the time, where the microbes are not active. And then the other half of that entity is pore space. And a good healthy soil, we want that pore space to be half of it being filled up with water, so it's available for the plants, and half of it to be airspace because those roots actually need to breathe as well. And then that mineral component is made up of 3 types of particles. They are of specific sizes: sand, which is your larger particle. It makes the soil gritty. And the silt, which makes it very silky and smooth, is slightly smaller. And then we have our clay particle, which is very small and is great for building bricks and makes that soil very heavy and dense, filling in all the spaces in between these other 2 particles. And in general, your soil is kind of made up of a combination of these, knowing what type of soil you have by getting some assistance from your agriculture agent that can help you find that out through a web soil survey. You can really, good thing to know. An easy way to get a baseline of this is take a shovel full of your soil, put it in a mason jar, filled half with soil, half with water, shake it for a good bit, leave it on the shelf and let it settle out. The sand particles will settle out first, then your silt, then your clay. Not all the clay will probably settle out, but it will give you, at least from a visual, a basic of understanding what percentage of each of them you have in the growing area. Then now on to that organic matter component. And organic matter is really the living, the dead, and the very dead within the soil. And so organic matter comes from residue, or maybe you add compost, or maybe there's some animal manure that breaks down, is broken down by the soil organisms. And those soil organisms do a great job of breaking them into their constituent parts, being all the nutrients that that organic matter took up in its life. It releases them back into the soil. It's taken up by the crop, and the cycle starts all over again. Now, just to kind of get a little bit deeper in what happens with that residue as well as the soil microbes. This very complex diagram here, I'll walk you through it, is kind of what happens to that organic matter. So at the top, we're going to start with the crop. As the crop grows, it is taking up the carbon dioxide and water, grows up, then it dies or is incorporated, it becomes residue. And then in come the soil microbes. They need a little bit of oxygen to do that. And they help to decompose that along with some water, but they also are releasing water and CO2 as they are breaking that down. And the crop, if it is there, can actively take that back up and put that into its parts. If not, perhaps that carbon dioxide is lost, either stored in the soil or lost into the environment. Then it becomes humic matter. It is actually immobilized by the soil microbes as they eat that, becomes part of them, but some of that also becomes proteins and polysaccharides, very fancy names for stuff that is part of the living organism as the fats and the proteins and the chitin within their bodies. But some of that also becomes part of the soil structure. So it leaves this whole system and becomes a part of the soil structure because the bacteria and the fungi and other organisms that live in there, well, they defecate, but they also exude different enzymes and sticky things that help to hold the soil particles together. And which is really important because it helps with aggregate stability, which when you're talking about soil health, one of the measurements that they look at is aggregate stability. That's the ability, if you take a piece of dried soil and you put water on it, it can actually hold up to that. So it's really like when a rainfall event happens and you get that kind of glossy part across some of the fields around that have been tilled a lot, often that has no aggregate stability. And what happens is that layer becomes smooth and no more water can infiltrate in, and now you have erosion. And so having that aggregate stability is really important. And so that comes from those organisms that do that, the soil organisms. But then those organisms kind of, they die, they croak. And as they also defecate, they release some of those nutrients, and that is called mineralization. So they munch and they release those nutrients, and they go either into the soil microbes in their own bodies to something else that eats it, or it goes back into the crop. And this cycle continues over and over again. Then we have those nutrients that are very important for the plants that are growing. And so there are three main ways that a plant takes up nutrients, and all of them are in the soil solution. So without water, the plant is not going to access a nutrient. But there are mass flow, diffusion, and root interception. And so the first one is the main and easy way that the plants can get it. They are taking up water, and along with it comes the nutrients. And mass flow is the way that often these mobile nutrients that are over here can easily flow along with the water. They move very well through the soil. Unfortunately, they are also so mobile that they can leach out of the soil as well. But those are easily taken up by the plant through mass flow. Then we have diffusion, which involves osmotic potential and a kind of a gradient of salinity. And so the plant can take that up, and often those are nutrients that need to be slightly closer to the root in the soil solution, but they don't have to be, with this last one, root interception. So with the case of phosphorus, phosphorus is a highly immobile nutrient in the soil, and the root actually has to grow over to where the phosphorus is in order to locate it. Except if you have a good hyphal community. If you have good fungal community, there's a lovely relationship, and they live right here in this rhizosphere. Many of the microorganisms are found here, and the reason why they live there is because there's a steady source of carbohydrates from the roots, because the plant exudes that kind of as a currency of exchanging, saying, hey, if you give me a little of that phosphorus or a little potassium or perhaps even nitrogen, I will give you a little bit of carbohydrate. And so it's a little banking system that happens in that rhizosphere that is beneficial. So it is good to curate the microbial community because they help to curate the plants. And the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to trying to balance the nutrient management in soil is the pH. That is, when you look at someone having an issue with their plants growing, often the first thing is the pH in the soil. And here I have this image of this experiment that was done with these grass plants, or likely they were corn plants. And the ones with the very long roots were grown with no aluminum, and they had an ideal pH. The ones with very short roots were grown with a pH of below 5.5, which would lead to a high amount of aluminum toxicity. And as you can see, those roots are probably not conducive for long-term growth for those plants. And if we look at an electron microscope, what we see is this is a healthy root on the left-hand side of this image pair. And the other root is grown with a low pH, highly acidic soil, which would have a lot of aluminum in it. And as you can see, that root almost looks like it's burned. It's definitely not going to grow very well. And that's the reason why pH matters so much. So what happens when we lime the soil? Well, we add some lime, and first of all, those aluminums, they move over and they become aluminum oxide because there is a chemical reaction that happens. I'm not going to get in depth with that, but it locks up the aluminum and is no longer going to bother those plants. It's not toxic to them anymore. But also what happens is we have some hydrogens that move off of this clay particle here, and they become carbonic acid. And so they also help to balance the system out. They've been leaving a space on here. These would be called our cation exchange capacity on our clay particle. They are little outlets for these positively charged ions to come over and float on over to cling onto that clay, and now to be held in there, waiting for when the plant actually needs to take it up. And another way to illustrate the influence of pH on nutrient availability, we have this chart here, and it shows the basic main macro and micronutrients that are needed for the plant. And on the bottom is kind of the pH scale, and it shows when they're really thin, it would be very unavailable within the soil, and when they're very wide, they'd be very much more available. And for most plants, the ideal pH is around 5.8 to 6.8 or so. And some of it depends on the type of plant you're growing. Obviously, if you're growing blueberries, just skip that. They like 4.5 because they've adapted to be able to deal with highly acidic soils. But that sweet spot's right there in the middle. And as you can see, most of the nutrients are predominantly available for them at that pH. Then there's one other thing, and this is why it's important to understand what type of soil you have, what's the texture of it. And it's a concept called buffering capacity. It's basically how much lime that you need to add to make an adjustment within the soil. And a lot of it has to do with the amount of clay. Because clay has that charge, it's going to hold on to a lot of things. And so it's kind of like you have an outlet and you got a whole lot more plugs. And in order to plug those outlets, you need a lot more things to plug into it. So looking at this, if we were to say we have a sandy loam soil and we want to raise that pH from a 5.5 to 5.9, we want to get it up to 6. As you can see, we need about 25 pounds per 1,000 square feet. But if we move over to the silt clay loam for that same amount of trying to raise that pH of only by 0.5 to even 1, we need 55 pounds. We need more than double that amount of lime. And so knowing what type of soil you have, and when you take a soil test and send that into the lab, they give you a lime recommendation that actually has this kind of taken into account. And so what works for one area of your property, if you have different soils in another area or even in a field, you would need to treat that slightly differently. And there is one other thing that influences pH, and that is actually our management practices. And some of it is when we add certain types of nutrients like ammonium fertilizers, that actually does help, or not help, but hinder your pH, and it actually reduces the pH level. So it increases your acidity. Also, in removing residue, it leads to more acidification of the soil. So by either incorporating a cover crop or leaving some residue there, it helps in benefiting and keeping that pH at a level of which you want. As you remove that crop, or you have some animals that graze there, sometimes you can end up then reducing that pH. So being cognizant of that, doing a soil test every year so you know what that is, because pH is probably the biggest thing that influences nutrient availability. So now that I've gotten the basics out of the way, and you can kind of understand the gist of Soils 101, I'm going to talk a little bit about the unique nature of a high tunnel. First, I think of high tunnel as anything, could be even a low tunnel, anything that's protected agriculture or a controlled environment. And you're trying to control either the soil moisture, you're controlling soil and air temperature, but some of these factors are just things that you have to think about. Also, the organic matter and how we deal with that can be slightly different within a high tunnel. Salinity also is something we need to be aware of. And then again, soil pathogens are something that can be a very important factor to take into consideration when thinking about growing in a high tunnel. So first, soil moisture. And I think that's kind of one of the biggest things, because without water, plants are not going to get nutrients and they're not going to grow very well. But of course, when we think of water, well, it's covered. So we're like, well, we have to add water to it. But your site at which you place that high tunnel is also a very important factor, ensuring that it's not down at the base of a hill where it happens that when it's a rainstorm, even though the water is not getting in from the top, it is flowing in from the sides, and you end up with this flooded condition like in this image here. And in that case, it can be a real problem, because now with that plastic there, you're going to end up having a very high humid environment and the water won't evaporate as easily. So you really are going to have to figure out how to get that out. And then water holding capacity is also something that is something you want to really think about. Is there ways to ensure you can hold on to any water that you bring into there? And then of course, as I've mentioned before, moisture does equal nutrient availability, and it is really important to have that moisture brought in through some irrigation to be able to ensure that the plants have that water right there near them and ready for them to be able to take up. Because in general, water and nutrients are being taken up by that root tip as well. And so making sure you have the water near where those roots are growing actively is an important factor in considering how you place those irrigation lines. And here's another figure to kind of illustrate a little bit of bringing in the soil texture component of knowing what is your makeup of your soil and how that affects the availability of water. And so on the base here, we have different types of soil listed. And on the side, this is the percent of water. And what we have is the wilting point. So this light blue at the bottom is called hydroscopic water. It's essentially the water that is impossible almost for the plant to be able to pull off due to some kind of chemical factors and the word escapes me at the moment. Old age brain fart, I guess. So hydroscopic water is where it's kind of attached to all the particles on the surface area of that. And if you have a lot of clay, you have a lot more surface area, because if you think about the outside of a clay particle and the surface of that, you can have many more of them in the same space. You can have a sand particle. You have so much more surface area that water is clinging to. So even though you can have 25% water within a very high clay content soil, that plant cannot access it. So it may seem moist, but it's not moist enough for the plant to have access to it. In the center here, we have the available water. And as you can see, it kind of changes from sand, where really no water is really going to stick around, and this limited amount between 25 and 35 for available water for clay. And that changes depending on that. So really understanding what type of soil texture you have will help you in coming up with the amount of water you need to add at a given time. Because if you have sand or a very sandy soil, it might be that you need to water more often rather than a lot, because it won't stay around. And this is where adding some organic matter can really benefit you, because it would increase in that kind of sponge effect in the water, and it's going to hold on to a lot more of the water and keep it there available for the plants. But in the reverse case, for clay, you want to do everything you can to be able to create pore spaces And whether that's adding in the organic matter that helps in making that soil a little bit more fluffy, and also cover crops that can break up that soil and make some micro and macro pores within that to get some of that water to infiltrate and have areas where it can store it, is also beneficial. So this is to kind of illustrate the difference between two types of soils and watering. So here we have this handy loam. This is a schematic of what happened when they watered with a drip irrigation. And in 15 minutes, you can see it went down by 12 inches. And each of these different colors, we have this one's 40 minutes and then 60 minutes and down to one whole day. And it gets all the way down to 72 inches down in the soil. But you can see this column is very narrow. So we move over to the clay loam, watered 4 hours, and we get about 24 inches deep. As you can see, the 4 hours time frame was probably down here for the sand, but it's very wide. And it took 2 days for that water to reach the same area as the sandy loam, but yet it has a very wide spacing of where that water went. So if I was thinking about trying to put irrigation lines in, I had very sandy soil, I would put those closer together, likely water much more often comparatively to the clay loam, where I would probably put my drip irrigations further apart. But placing them near the root zone and maybe only watering for 4 hours at a time, because I don't want to saturate my system as well. And the reason why I bring this up is because it's very important to understand that microbes, like humans and like plants, need water as well. And so the reason why nutrients are not going to be available, one, for uptake because it's not in the soil solution, but also because microbes are not going to be actively decomposing and releasing nutrients without that water level as well. And so it's kind of a twofold thing. It needs to be available for the plants, but it also needs to be available for the biological component within the soil. But when we bring in water, it's also important to ensure that we test that irrigation water to ensure we know what is the pH of it, because that you've now tested your pH in your soil, you've adjusted it, you've done all this stuff, and bring in water. If that water has a pH that is going to then affect that, it's important to know what that is. Alkalinity, which is slightly different than the pH, it's an important measure to know as well, because that can affect some of the nutrient availability. Looking at the amount of dissolved solids. And then finally, and probably one of the most important aspects, is understanding the electrical conductivity of your water. And around here, it's probably not such an issue, but if you were to live near the coast, that may be a problem. When I went to Sicily to see some really amazing greenhouse operations over there, they had to have a reverse osmosis machine in order to irrigate their crops. And they use grafted tomatoes and grafted plants because they can actually deal better with a higher electrical conductivity. And electrical conductivity is just the measure of how many solutes you have within the water, basically how salty it is. So if you have a very high electrical conductivity, it makes it very difficult for that plant to take the water up, just like as if you were to try to grow a plant in a salty solution, it's just not going to be able to take up the water. And that's why that component is important. And of course, if you're in a high tunnel, you're already going to be predisposed to high salinity conditions. And so knowing this number is an important factor. And then moving on to the soil and air temperature. In North Carolina, using a high tunnel in the off season, when it's kind of the fall all the way to the spring, is great, because it's going to really give you a whole lot more warmth. But then understanding in the summertime right now, it's probably really, really hot inside that high tunnel. And understanding the effect of that high tunnel on not just the air temperature for the plants, but the soil temperature as well. Because it is important to understand, yes, that high tunnel helped you plant earlier and really get in the soil earlier, but then what is the effect in the summertime, and being able to manage that with some shade cloth or something along those lines. But also, what do you do within that tunnel can affect the soil temperature, not just the plastic that's on the top. And this experiment looked at bare ground within the high tunnel as well as mulched soil. and the temperature differential from day and night across time. And what we see is the mulched ground actually had a more stable soil temperature, whereas the bare ground fluctuated very on both extremes. It went hotter as well as cooler between the time points of day and night. And so as you can see here, this mulch layer really does help kind of buffer that fluctuations, which would benefit your soil microbial community. And so when I'm talking about the summertime, why it's important to kind of do things to help keep that soil cool is this graphic here shows temperature on the x-axis, and we have microbial activity on the y. And what this is basically showing is that at a very low temperature, and we'll say around 32, we have very low microbial activity. As the temperature increases, the microbial activity increases as well. And then around 100 degrees Fahrenheit, it basically crashes. So when that soil temperature reaches that high, those microbes are basically dying off and no longer going to be able to be beneficial to you. And of course, then they take a little bit longer to recover because some may go dormant, but at that point, there is no microbial activity there. But if you're trying to solarize your soil, that is a good point. Make sure you get above 100, and it might get rid of them. So in talking about organic matter, again, really beating this dead horse is that microbial community equals the nutrients for your plants. Organic matter is important, but we kind of can have too much of a good thing. I have known of people having up to 13% organic matter in their high tunnel, and then they had a whole heap load of problems with all sorts of other issues of fungal and nematodes and other things coming in. So in knowing that you add it slowly over time, because what you want is that organic matter to actually become part of the soil structure through time. As those organisms break that organic matter down, they put it into humic matter, and that humic acid and fulvic acid, which become part of the soil, it is there, and those nutrients are held, being able to be stored there. And it becomes something that is like a savings account for your nutrients. And of course, a high amount of organic matter can also lead to salts being built up near the surface, because the salts are really just kind of ionic blends that are there. And so because you're having this evaporation that's happening within a high tunnel all the time, you can end up with that issue when you have too much organic matter. And then, of course, some of the nutrients can be lost to leaching on the outside, but when the inside, because you're controlling your water, you can actually reduce some of the leaching loss by, controlling your water, you can help in reducing the leaching within a high tunnel, because it's not going to rain within there. So you can control how much water is going to be there, and the organic matter can actually hold it there. So a little bit is good, a lot is not, but also know your source. If you're going to say bring in compost, those of you familiar with this area, we've had some issues with some compost being kind of contaminated because the source is coming from some animal manures or straw or other matter that came out of likely a hay field. And this is a certain type of herbicide that is a broadleaf herbicide. And they spray it on a hay field. It's not going to harm the hay. They can feed it to the animals, but unfortunately, it takes a very long time to break down. It passes through the gut of the animal all the way out the other side. It's used for compost, and it can wreak havoc on tomato plants, especially. So if you see some crazy looking leaves, it's likely not a virus. It could be if you added compost. They generally will grow out of it a little bit. They'll just not be the highest yield that year. It will break down in a couple of years and be fine. But if you were banking on a great tomato crop and you ended up putting a lot of compost on it, knowing where that source is, knowing you had something that was coming out of an organic hay field and they're not using a picolinic acid type herbicide, then you generally can be a little bit more rest assured, or a compost that is not made from animal manure or other hay or straw. So another way to increase our organic matter, which is a little bit of more an assured way, is getting those cover crops. But you have to think about how you fit that into your rotation, because obviously if you have a high tunnel, it's limited space and you want to get that space is at a premium. But it can be used to help break up a pathogen cycle, especially if you only have one high tunnel and maybe you've grown tomatoes in it for a long time and you've now have some pathogen issues. You can grow some cover crops in there. Having active living things is going to have those microbes in there that are going to help bring that balance back into that soil. And they can help hold on to nutrients as well as bring nutrients up from deeper down in the soil. And they can improve that compaction, allowing that water that is there to go down deeper into the soil and allow the airspace as well, because that's important. And then if you do end up with some salinity issues, you can grow some sunflower, millet, or mustard, which they can uptake some of that salt and be utilized, and then harvest that top and remove that. That helps to remove some of that salt from the high tunnel. But then there's another alternative, and that's looking at living mulch, and you could have your crop and then use some living mulch there as well. That can be helpful in having kind of both giving the nutrients to the plants as well as helping in weed suppression. And this experiment looked from the University of Minnesota, looked at comparing landscape fabric to rye, camelina, and canola in the effect of both organic matter and whether it went up or down, and nitrogen. And as you can see, with the landscape fabric, it went down, and the rye as well went down. And both of this is depending on what time they measured. Likely this obviously did not add, because if you're growing on landscape fabric, it's not adding any organic matter or nitrogen. You would have to fertilize. This with ryegrass, it likely actually took it up, but if you allowed it to break down over time more as a cover crop, then it would release that nitrogen and organic matter back into the soil. The camelina actually increased the organic matter, but it reduced the nitrogen, and the canola actually increased both organic matter and nitrogen. So that is something to look into if you're interested in that. Some promising things, because often a lot of people think that if you grow a living mulch, it's going to compete with your crop for both water and nutrients, and that isn't always the case. So focusing on that microbial component, it's important to try to think about ways and things that we do that help increase microbial diversity, because there are good microbes and bad microbes, just like there are good insects and bad insects. And so we want to try to bring balance within the system. And so doing things that help curate and bring about the good bugs is always a good thing. So some of the things that we do that affect that is our inputs of chemical fertilizers and other herbicides and pesticides that can harm or benefit. It probably benefits yield, but perhaps can harm the beneficial insects as well as the beneficial microbes within the soil. Bringing about crop diversification can really help in bringing balance, because the reason why, if you're growing the same thing all the time, you get a high disease pressures because you're choosing that particular organism, you're feeding it the thing it likes. But if you switch out of that to something completely different and grow that, well, that microbe doesn't prefer that particular thing, and it will die off because it doesn't have what it likes to eat. Adding soil amendments also does affect this, as well as how much water is there. If you have a lot of water, it's a very waterlogged system, and it tends to be wet all the time, you can end up with a high pathogen load because you have certain pathogens or fungal, even in the air, that really benefit that environment. So understanding what influences that is important, as well as tillage. If you disturb the soil, generally you tend to disturb the microbial community, and that often can lead to it being out of balance. And so in looking at how we control a soil pathogen, often what we do is we look at this kind of disease triangle. And how that works is we have these three things that influence the size of that triangle. We have the plant host, what crop you're growing, the type of pathogens that's there and the environment, an environmental factor. So if we adjust any one of these, we would reduce the size of the triangle. So if we focus on something that is in the environment that causes that pathogen to grow, and we fix that problem, even though we haven't addressed the pathogen or the plant host, we actually, in fact, reduce the size of the triangle. But ultimately, what we want to do is look at all three of these factors and really reduce that disease down much more. And so this can happen by, of course, crop rotation, as I've said before. Perhaps you put in a movable high tunnel, and now you can move to a different location, you're on a different soil, and that is another way to work with that. Solarization by heating up the soil. And lastly, through fumigation, but also being cognizant that after you fumigate, you need to do practices to rebuild that microbial community back up because you have now disturbed it completely. So again, on that soil disturbance is the tillage. And tillage, not only does it wreck the homes of all the soil microbes, but it also can lead to organic matter loss. And often the reason why that happens is now you have just given a huge influx of oxygen in there that's sped up those microbes, and they eat even faster and reduce the amount of organic matter, but also that leads to carbon dioxide loss into the atmosphere as well. And it reduces the soil aggregation, as I mentioned before. That is probably the biggest measurement across all spaces and times that we have looked at that leads to soil health is soil aggregation, when all others seem like a little out of sync and maybe good in one place and not in another. And then that disturbance really does disturb all those microbes that live around and within the root and the rhizosphere of the plant. And this is a schematic showing the arbuscle mycorrhizae fungi, which is just a fancy word for saying fungi or fungi. And that is able to create a symbiotic relationship with the root, kind of grows into the cells and kind of makes this little bubble in there where it is able to exchange carbohydrates and get them from the plant, but it is able to give the plant the nutrients that it needs. And so it wants to curate this relationship. And so they are both benefiting from it. And so they both put into the relationship. And if you are disturbing very near the roots and in that area, you disturb that fungal hyphae, and they cannot travel as far to get the nutrients. And so that is another reason why it is important, or try to reduce the disturbance, especially when you are in the midst of growing the crops. And so some things you can do for no-till operation is you can either create some raised beds, so they're permanent and you can easily get into them because that soil is not going to be compacted. It's going to have some better tilth, but perhaps you could do a little bit of sheet mulching. That also works, as well as a combination of both of those two. And so you can get kind of creative in ways that you can actually grow in a no-till method and reduce kind of that energy savings as well, which is part of sustainability. So to conclude, there's an awful lot here that I presented, but really know the soil is probably the most important part. Understand what is under your feet. Moisture does influence the microbial activity more than anything else. By ensuring that you are keeping your high tunnel cool, especially in the height of the growing season, is going to benefit both your plants as well as the microbes. Understanding that organic matter is important, but too much of a good thing is never good. And rotating for disease management is really important to have a rotation of crops within there out of different species and different families. So don't go from tomato to eggplant. They are both in the same family. So you would want to go from maybe tomato to growing carrots or something else, or melons. And then be aware that salinity can build up. And so that plastic on that high tunnel often only lasts, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years or so. And so when you take it off, perhaps maybe give a little bit of time so that some rainfall events can come along and help leach some of the salts back down into the subsoil. That would be one way to deal with that. And then ensure that you are thinking about compaction and disturbance and trying to ensure that your microbes are happy in their little home, and they will in turn make you happy. So with that, I will take any questions that you have and or any comments. So I'm going to pause this so that I can see everyone and all of that. And I'll stop my share. Do we have any questions? Because I'm scrolling through the chat. I don't see any yet. That's a good question. I do not see many movable tunnels, and how common are they? Well, I'm not sure about North Carolina. I know Elliot Coleman kind of was the guy who started the movable high tunnel. I have spoken to him. He works up there in Maine with, I think it's Rivoli is the name of the, or something along, very close to that. I think movable high tunnels are one of those things that it depends if you have a flat area and you're really going to move to a high tunnel, you can utilize them. Takes a little bit of thinking about how you're going to adapt to that, but I don't think that they are as well adopted as perhaps they could be if you're on a small operation and you want to really diversify. The University of New Hampshire does quite a bit. We have, there's a movable high tunnel there, and they have done quite a bit of research in looking at utilizing that movable high tunnel to be able to, grow a crop on the outside and then move that over when it needs the protection. So you have maybe tomatoes in the one tunnel, and then you have something that you want to start outside, but that could use a little bit of help over the winter. Then you can move that high tunnel after you've cleaned the tomato crop out. All right, so let me see. Earthworms in the soil. Yes, earthworms are, although not native to North America, at least not since the last ice age happened to probably likely kill them all out. They came over probably in some soil that somebody brought over from Europe. But earthworms are really important for creating macropores that help with the soil. They also are wonderful for creating some really great worm compost, which I think are pretty dandy. And so I like to say that earthworms are very important in helping to say munch down some larger particles of organic matter, bring them down into the soil and be able to feed the smaller microbes, because the soil food web benefits from having them in it. Let's see, would adding some shade cloth in summertime during tomato production affect much of the production? So one of the things you can do, likely it would not, first of all, because even though it may seem like they're shaded somewhat, it depends on how thick or how dense that shade cloth is. As long as enough photons, which is light, in which the plants actually pick up the pieces of light, which are called photons, that travel through that, as long as that light is high enough, they generally would get enough light. They would get a lot more light than, say, perhaps maybe shaded by a big tree, because that is going to block all the light. And the tree is actually taking the photons out as it's passing through, compared to the shade cloth, which doesn't benefit from taking any photons. And so I think it is one of those things that you could either get a light meter to check. If you're in Durham County, I have a light meter. I'm happy to come out and stick it under there and measure it, because on a cloudy day, or even near where we perceive light in what we would perceive as not super shady, you may have a measurement of about 400 micromoles, which is enough for a plant to be quite happy. On a sunny day outside with no shade at all, in the sun, it is about 2,000 micromoles. So there is a large amount of area to play with without losing all of that. Okay. Is there a way to measure salt? Yes, there is. In fact, when you do a soil test, if you do the farmer's soil test, the full-on one, and so there's two different sheets that the lab will give you, and you want the full diagnostic one, they actually do measure salt. But they just measure generally sodium. But often you can kind of tell when you have salt buildup, because you can start to see white little particle kind of on the top of the soil. And when you start to see that, and anyone who's grown a house plant, likely after a while, you start to get that film, especially if it's in a clay pot. That is what salt buildup looks like. Let's see. I help at a school with a small high tunnel and am still a beginner. Any references you can recommend? I will save this chat, and Shauna, I will send some information to you. So when we're using the sheet mulch, so I'm not sure about, it depends on how you use the sheet mulch. When you're using cardboard, it's really important to make sure you soak it. It should be completely wet so that in fact it actually is going to come in contact with the soil and the microbes will come up, but also putting a heavy mulch layer. I mean, I use sheet mulch here in my own garden outside, and I have not had much of an issue with air pockets underneath of there. It's really important to just make sure that that stuff is really wet so then it kind of starts to mold to the ground. NCA&T, they use 2 movable high tunnels. So they're useful, but they're also a pain. Yes, they can be a pain to move a little bit. So movable high tunnels are often called, well, caterpillar tunnels are slightly different than a movable high tunnel, at least from my rudimentary understanding. Is caterpillar tunnels are essentially very easy to be able to put up. They're not kind of affixed down in the ground like some of the more sturdier high tunnels, but yes, they can easily be moved to another location. So technically, yes, you could call a caterpillar tunnel a movable high tunnel. But what I mean by movable high tunnel is actually has little wheels and it's on bars, and it's like a big high tunnel. It's got the sturdy pipes that are like 2 inches in diameter for the structure or the arch, and they can actually be rolled over to another location. So they're kind of rolled over the bars. So this is a whole setup where this movable high tunnel can be rotated back and forth a little bit easier, although generally you need a tractor to kind of tug it along. We have another poll that I would love for those of you who are still on to take. It's kind of judging what you got from this presentation. And then I am always happy to have suggestions on things that you would like to see in the future. So you can feel free to either reach out to me via email or even stick it in the chat here if you have a suggested talk. Let's see. The jumping Asian earthworm. Linda, I have not heard of this. I need to research it. Heard about that one that has the flat head thing, but not any jumping Asian earthworm, but it's probably an invasive. And so I probably have to do a little research on that one. Oh, a proponent for using peat or cocoa in soil amendments or mulch. Well, to use peat moss, although peat moss is really good, you do have to be aware that it often tends to be highly acidic. But I'm trying to steer away from utilizing peat in things that I do, mostly because that is being harvested and it's kind of like taking a fossil fuel out, right? It's the carbon that was stored there from in a peat bog. And so when we take that out and we utilize it, we're releasing that carbon that's already stored right there. So from an environmental aspect, kind of like coconut coir better because it's more of a renewable resource because that tree actively grew in this century to create that. And then we are able to utilize that. So it's, as long as we continue to grow those trees, we continue to recycle that nutrient a little bit better. And that is it for the questions. And I appreciate you all taking the time to do the poll. And next up, next month, we have a presentation from NRCS talking a little bit more about soil health from their perspective. And then we have one coming up in September, which is myself again, talking about just the basics of soil health and the basics of soils. And then In October, we have Dr. Allison Eagle from the Environmental Defense Fund doing a presentation. And then so far, I have also scheduled out to November. We have Dr. Fred Madoff, who actually wrote the book with Dr. Van Ness called Building Better Soils. So he will be presenting on the link between plant and soil health through the lens of the kind of pathogen relationship and how the pathogens in plants and soil can kind of communicate. So that is all I have. I really appreciate your time. And if you need anything, just email me. Everyone have a great evening.